Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back talking about The Amazing Race, and here we'll be doing a review for season 33, which was a really interesting season coming into it, largely due to the production of it, obviously with it having started production before COVID and completing filming 19 months later, which to me did kind of bolster my excitement for the season, with me just wanting to see how they would handle this break and see how things changed post-COVID. And to be honest, it didn't really end up changing that much, outside of certain teams obviously not being able to come back and some minor changes here and there for the structure of the legs, but really not much really changed. And with us abruptly losing almost half the remaining teams, and us having the return of these teams that were already eliminated and them not doing that well on the return, and it really just felt like the season was kind of meandering around following the break, but I guess that's better than nothing. I mean, obviously that's what they had to do to finish out the season here, and while it didn't play out in the ideal way for me, I do still really like this cast, which ends up being the main pro for this season, but I do feel like it is a season that ends up being really inconsistent, largely due to all these issues with production. But to talk through the season, I'll be running through the season episode by episode, and with that, let's start off with episode 1, which bizarrely starts off with the players at their homes getting a message from Phil to go to London, a similar style of intro as with the influencer season, and it kind of made sense there, I guess, but here it just feels really bizarre. I mean, especially considering that this was obviously pre-COVID, so this ends up being like the first normal season of the show to not have an official starting line, and that was just weird. I also just hated how these intros were portrayed, which felt very Big Brother-y, with it feeling just really unnatural, and how these players were reacting. But everyone ends up traveling to London, and along the way we get this similar style of intros as with the last few seasons, where the teams get introduced periodically throughout the episode, and right away we do see Akbar and Sherry come off as this really likable duo, which is humorous considering the animosity between them later in the race. Anthony and Spencer, Raquel and Kayla, and Ryan and Dusty all get a bevy of personal content early on, with them also seeming like really strong teams as well, which would make me look at them as top contenders right away. Arun and Natalia also came off as really likable here, talking about how they're super fans, which made them a team that I really wanted to root for moving forward in the season. Connie and Sam end up being at the back of the pack initially, and while they don't play that much of a factor on the season, I did find their first leg here to be pretty entertaining, especially at the Detour, where they have to find a Bobby, and them not knowing what a Bobby is, which, I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't instantly know either, but I wouldn't have expected it to be a random person named Bobby, like Sam believed it to be, and they really just end up stumbling across the right guy eventually, which is funny as well. As I mentioned earlier, we do get some fighting between Akbar and Sherry, with Sherry seeming to slow them down with her just walking, and obviously while I do get why Akbar would be annoyed here, it did feel like he was a bit mean-spirited during these confrontations, at least from how it is portrayed on the show. Also, it did feel weird that by the time of the Detour, like half the teams still hadn't really been properly introduced. And while they do quickly introduce the remaining teams at that point, it did make me feel like those remaining teams like are probably not winning the season, despite it including him and Penn. Now, I will say that I do also wonder if these first few episodes from pre-COVID were actually edited during the break without the knowledge of the later episodes, as I do feel like there are some conflicting points you can bring up for either being the case, but it is definitely something that I think is a possibility considering, one, the quick turnaround of the season, but also how there are certain story arcs that are set up here that really just lead to nothing, which you would think that if this was edited before the break, they would have tried to dial down on those. But moving forward, we do see a few teams actually work together, obviously not as tightly as what we saw happen on season 32, but we do have this grouping of Anthony and Spencer and Ryan and Dusty that really seemed like a dangerous combination here, considering they were clearly two of the better teams in the race, and had it not been for COVID, I would not have been surprised to see these two teams completely run the show. We do obviously get to the pit stop where, and what is the shocker of the night, Anthony and Spencer and Ryan and Dusty end up being teams 1 and 2, followed by Raquel and Kayla, who, as I mentioned again, those three teams initially seemed to be the clear strongest teams here. And all of them did one particular detour, which did seem easier than the other, with the other one being this graffiti detour where it was secretly a puzzle that you had to put together. And this really ends up screwing over Michael and Mo, with them not realizing that it was a puzzle initially. And while they tried to fix their puzzle afterwards, the pieces were already wet and broke apart, causing them to have to do it a third time with new pieces. And while it does come down to them and Lulu and Lala, with Mike and Mo actually finishing the detour first, they do get lost along the way to the pit stop. top, and we end up losing them here, which, again, I was kind of sad to see, as I just feel like they were pretty likable from the little screen time that they were given. It didn't seem like that bad of a team, considering they got to the Detour in a pretty decent position. Obviously, this isn't the end of their story, so we'll talk about them a bit more later. But this was only the first episode of the premiere, which had 2 episodes back-to-back. And with that, let's jump into episode 2. Which had the team staying in London, which makes sense considering the 2-part episode, though I do feel like it's weird that this second leg here was a non-elimination leg, as it would have made a lot more sense to end this 2-parter with an elimination instead of having one in the middle of it. Also, I did feel like the leg design here was just really lame. I mean, normally I don't care about these sort of things, but I did feel like the tasks during this leg felt very half-assed to a humorous degree, but despite that, we do get some interesting moments from it. The episode does start with Anthony and Spencer struggling to find a cab, and in Amazing Race fashion, we cut to commercial just for them to find a cab right after we come back, which again is an element of the editing that hasn't changed here. But this did start what would end up being a rocky leg for Anthony and Spencer, with them ending up in the middle of the pack. We do also get Akbar and Sherry talk about having to listen to each other more, which doesn't seem to stick. We get to the Roadblock, which was really ridiculous, with them having to look for the correct envelope in a box, and they literally just planted it right at the bottom of the box, to the point where it was so easy to find that Penn and Rey don't trust that it could be that easy, and end up continuing their search anyway, which ends up wasting more time. And again, all this was a really fun segment. You also have Raquel finding it right away while Anthony is struggling to find it. You also have him telling Penn and Rey that they have it, but they don't end up trusting him and proceed to study the envelopes and the stamps. And again, all this was just so ridiculous, which again made this a really fun roadblock despite how cheap it felt. Those does end up leading to a fight between Caro and Rey, with their bickering really encompassing the majority of their content. After this, we get to the Detour, which again felt really imbalanced here, with the choice between throwing darts or decorating cakes with flags of the EU. And while most teams did end up decorating the cakes, it seemed pretty clear that the darts were so much quicker, with every team that went for the darts passing any other team that went for the cakes. And this led to Ryan and Dusty easily coming in first here, with the pit stop weirdly being inside of a bus, with the players just sitting down with Phil as he gives them the results, and this felt really awkward. But obviously we learned that they're still racing, so I guess it makes sense, kind of, that this isn't a real pit stop. The cake task, though, had some drama with some teams not getting the countries right, thinking that UK was still in the AU, and the same thing goes for Norway. And I did find the judge for this task to be kind of humorous, with him just being very loose with his rulings. But again, really, I never had any doubt that Lulu and Lala were going to be last here, with them being on the bottom the entire leg. And I do get this really awkward arguments over, I guess, what one of their exes said, and that was just kind of weird. But again, they continue racing at the end of the episode, so again, the results here didn't really matter that much. But this did end the first night of the season, which was a really strong one, especially from a character standpoint, where I did really like the cast here after the premiere, even though I did feel like the legs themselves were pretty mediocre. But that we're jumping to episode 3, where the players go on a train to Glasgow, meaning that everyone is equalized once again making that previous leg pointless. But this does end up being a self-drive leg, which we knew post-COVID that legs like this were going to be pretty prominent, but it was interesting to see them here before COVID. But this did become a major source of conflict between Caro and Rey, with Caro having never driven and Rey having just learned stick shift and really just sucks at it, leading to their arguing again over his driving, with him leaving the car and her trying to console him, and he pushes her away. Again, what a shocker that they didn't make it much longer after the show. But it did feel weird that this did seem to be setting up a season-long arc of them learning to be supportive of each other, but again, obviously it goes nowhere. We then get to the roadblock of them having to put together bagpipes, and that was boring. We get a detour of having to sing a song in a kilt or having to fix whiskey barrels. And the barrel task was again really boring, but the kilt task did have some fun moments, from Penn turning into a diva and the song of Donald, Where's Your Trousers getting stuck in my head. But Kim and Penn come out of it in front and end up winning the leg, and unsurprisingly, Ryan and Dusty and Anthony and Spencer follow immediately afterwards. We do then get a lot of talk from Raquel and Kayla about being the strong all-woman team, which really ends up being their major storyline in the season, along with how they want a strong female team to win the season. But really the majority of this leg did focus around Arun and Natalya, with them having this spectacular downfall here, with them making mistakes left and right across the episode. They start the episode by missing the exit to the roadblock. They end up helping the other teams at the roadblock, leading to other teams passing them when they stop to get directions. We see them get lost on their way to Detour anyway, and really the most egregious of all these mistakes is them changing detours without seeming to even try at the barrel task, and them changing to the singing task that Arun was clearly not meant for. And with all these mistakes, and Akbar and Sherry, who had been in last for most of the leg, having passed them, it didn't make it pretty clear that Arun and Natalya were going to get eliminated here. But again, it's not the end of the story just yet. And the episode doesn't even end there, as this was the final leg shot before the break, leading to us getting to see the scene where Phil announces that the race is on hold, which I will say, this scene was really underwhelming to me. I really felt like we didn't get any genuine reactions here. I mean, looking back at like BBCan 8 and seeing the cast there getting updates throughout the season about COVID and eventually learning that a show is canceled and seeing all their reactions and this heartbreak and all this emotion going on in these scenes, I mean, that was really impactful moment there, but here it was just like nothing. They really just yada yada it here, and we don't get to hear from any of the teams, and we just fast forward 19 months later to where we see the starting line with only 5 of the remaining teams coming back here, which get really mind-blowing to me, considering obviously we knew that 7 teams returned after the break, but to learn that only 5 of those were actually teams that were in the race at the time was a shocking revelation to me, and overall that does harm my opinion of the season, where moving forward, it really just felt like an exhibition match to me, just due to how wonky of a season this ends up being. But with that, let's talk about the teams that didn't end up coming back, starting with Taylor and Isaiah, who I haven't even mentioned in this review up until this point, as again, they were mostly irrelevant to the season, never getting much focus on the show, especially after the premiere. They seem to be likable enough, but just weren't shown that much on the show. Now, from what I understand, they supposedly were supposed to come back here, but had to drop out at the last second due to a death in the family. So obviously a terrible situation for them to go through there, and I do feel for them in that situation, but again, I just wish they were more present on the show. Next up, we have Caro and Rey, who again were supposedly going to be there, but then couldn't because Caro had some visa issues with her being a German citizen, which again sucks that they couldn't return, especially considering how they broke up over the course of the break, and it would have been interesting to see that dynamic as exes now. And I did find their arguing to be one of the highlights of this last episode, so I was underwhelmed to just abruptly lose them here, again with the edit making it seem like they were going to have a deeper run. We then have Connie and Sam, who weren't back for a happier reason, in that Connie was pregnant, but through that, again, I don't feel like we got to know them that much. Like Taylor and Isaiah, I do feel like they were kind of purpled in the edit after the premiere. They did have a fun premiere with a couple of fun moments, and they did seem like a competent team with solid legs 2 and 3, so I do think they had some potential had the season continue on, but again, I just don't feel like I know much about them. And really, to me, the team that had the most potential that didn't end up coming back here was definitely Anthony and Spencer, who were my winner picks coming into the season. So again, kind of sucks to lose them in this way, but beyond that, they were clearly one of the front runners on the season, along with Ryan and Dusty, and really had those two teams been able to work together moving forward, I do feel like they would have had a very easy path to the end, and I do feel like their presence was really missed to me, not because I thought they were the most riveting TV, but more so because I think it really narrowed down the field of potential winners. That really led to a lot less intrigue moving forward. But with that, let's move on to episode 4, the first episode post-COVID, which again kind of just underwhelmed me, where to me I was really interested in how they were going to handle the transition between pre and post-COVID, and they kind of don't. Now, obviously, we do get the starting line, and Phil talks to the teams, barely mentions the teams that didn't come back. And yeah, I know they posted a video online explaining why each of the teams can come back, and that's cool, but it's like, why wasn't that on their show? And that felt very jarring to me. I really felt like the producers were just trying to skip over the more personal elements of the COVID situation here, and just try to get back to a race as quickly as possible, which, I mean, I get, but also is not exactly what I personally wanted from it. Again, I think a major example of that is something like the flight attendants, who were obviously people that were greatly affected by COVID, having lost their jobs during that period of time, yet we hear very little from them, outside of them just mentioning that they lost their jobs. Though a storyline that does start here that ends up being one mentioned numerous times moving forward is the death of Lulu and Lala's grandmother, And along with this element of the talk of wanting an all-woman team to win, it did make them really shoot up in my potential winner estimations here. Also, this is where we get the reveal that since only 5 teams can make it back, the 2 eliminated teams are brought back into the race, which at this point essentially just makes this a full-blown reset, which I do think was necessary, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a negative effect on the season to me. Now, again, I agree with the decision to bring back these eliminated teams in this situation. It's definitely better than bringing in new teams or returning teams from previous seasons, but again, to be honest, I know this wasn't a likely possibility, but I really would have liked them to just hold off on filming the season for a bit longer. Now again, I know this isn't realistic considering how much planning goes into the show, and to stop the entire production just because you couldn't get 1 or 2 other teams is not, again, realistic, but I do think it would have made for a better season had they been able to wait a little bit to get Taylor and Isaiah back after they had dealt with their family matter, to get Caro and Rey back after being able to work out their issues with the visa, potentially even maybe get Anthony and Spencer back if Anthony could get time off of work. To me, in an ideal world, I would have liked them to wait a bit here till they had more people locked in, but again, I get why they continued on here. It's just an underwhelming element of the season to me. And because I do feel like this season lost a lot of its suspense here, with the difference between the top teams and the bottom teams being pretty large. Now, from a leg standpoint, one of the changes post-COVID is the lack of public transportation, with all transportation being either chartered or self-driving, which again, I've always personally liked the self-driving legs, so I don't have much of an issue with that here. You also do notice that the teams were wearing masks while they were indoors, but outside of that, again, the race really just felt mostly the same, especially considering how task-based recent seasons of the show have been. So it mostly felt like the same show, just probably with more tasks that were outdoors. But we do get our first roadblock of them just having to walk along a cliffside, and I found that pretty boring. Outside of the main notable moment here coming from Akbar being upset at Sherry once again, after she ends up taking much longer than everyone else, which again, humorous to see that they haven't changed in the last 19 months. The detour is either attach ornaments to a belt or do a flag routine, and most teams do the flag routine, and what do you know, all those teams get 1st through 5th. Including Akbar and Sherry, who are way behind, which I did find humorous how Phil tries to fake them out only for Akbar to figure it out early. That was a fun moment, but once again, Ryan and Dusty dominate this leg, despite the flag routine not being their forte. Also, something I did find humorous is how post-COVID we actually had greeters at the pit stops, despite the fact that we didn't have any pre-COVID, which again, you would think the opposite. But really, I did feel like the episode as a whole felt pretty disjointed, where again, out of nowhere, both Arun and Natalia and Michael and Mo end up being at the bottom, at the belt task, and here we do see Mike and Mo making the same mistake as last time in not paying attention to the order, and through that end up being behind. But again, the reality of the situation is that both these teams were at the bottom due to an unaired speed bump, and while from a race perspective, I like the element of these teams having a speed bump considering they were already eliminated, what is underwhelming is that I automatically put them on the bottom. From a TV standpoint, I just think it ends up being really underwhelming to see the same team get eliminated again, with here Mike and Mo, despite having raced a solid leg here, with them being in the middle of the pack for a decent amount of it. But with that, let's talk about Mike and Mo, who again, I know people are calling them the Francescas of The Amazing Race, and while I guess that is an apt enough comparison considering again they were the first boot twice, I think like Francesca, that doesn't necessarily mean I look at them as a bad team. While I don't feel like they had much win equity, I don't think of them as the worst team ever by any stretch of the imagination. And for the most part, they were middle of the pack for most of the 2 legs that they competed in, with them having made the same mistake twice at both detours, which ended up losing them time. But even here, I don't think that's what really sealed their fate, as it seemed like the speed bump was really what put them as far back as they were. And while it was interesting to see them being booted here again from a historical standpoint, I was underwhelmed to see them not do better on the return. Now for episode 5, which to me was a really slow episode, and while at first I thought it was because the Celebrity Big Brother cast came out during it and I was distracted for most of the rest of the episode, I did end up rewatching the episode, and even then I found it pretty dull. Now here we do get to see how the teams are going to depart from this point forward, with them being dispatched in groups every 15 minutes, which I did feel like this was kind of underwhelming to see the previous placements not matter as much, with the top 2 teams leaving at the same time, which just felt like an unnatural equalizer, but at the end of the day, it's they were going to equalize them anyway, so it probably doesn't matter too much. But this leg does stay in Switzerland, but here they have to drive to Lugano where they have to bungee jump off a dam, which didn't do much for me. I mean, the show tries to use this as personal content for Kim and Sherry, but again, didn't really care personally. The detour ends up being a choice between having to make sausages or transport wine and nuts, which the majority of the players go for the wine and nuts, during which we get another fight between Sherry and Akbar over Sherry slowing them down, which again, what's new? Lulu and Lala do the sausage task and get a lot of content about their grandmother again, which can really propel them above the flight attendants for me in terms of winner potential, where the flight attendants edit really had dropped after the break here, with them seeming to be there only to propel this notion of wanting an all-women team to win, with them not really getting that much focus in the episode outside of them ending up at the bottom of the pack for most of the leg due to them taking the scenic routes, which again felt like them getting a bit of a dodo edit there, while Lulu and Lala keep on getting propped up throughout these last few episodes, end up coming in second here. But obviously Ryan and Dusty once again win this leg because that's what they do. And really, this entire episode to me had no real stakes to it, as Arun and Natalia end up getting lost once again early on in the episode, to the point where we don't even see them entering the city of Lugano until the other teams are already finished. Which again made it really clear that Arun and Natalia were coming in last here, but also really just shows you how bad they are at following directions, where like previously they've been bad, but it felt like those issues were a bit more minor. Like this leg pretty much solely comes down to this one mistake, but they somehow got like an hour out of the way, and the show really just like montages their entire leg with everyone else having already finished, only for us to find out it is a non-elimination leg, which again makes us feel pointless. Though I did find it humorous to see how Phil was like scolding them at the pit stop, but again, overall, a lackluster episode to me. Now for episode 6, which to me was one of the better post-COVID episodes, largely due to the fact that we see the first real mistake from Ryan and Dusty, and the results of this leg seem to be very, very close. Now we do start the episode with the racers getting on a chartered flight to Corsica. Again, a change here due to COVID, though, again, from what I understand, most recent seasons have been using chartered flights anyway, but at least here on the show, they've become more transparent about it. But right away, we do have this setup of what big threats Ryan and Dusty are, and even the previews had been setting this up as they were going to be in danger, which made me think even more so that they were going to make it through it. But I was surprised at how far behind they seemed to be. But really at this point in the season, it did seem like this, like, will Ryan and Dusty make a mistake was the main source of intrigue here from a race perspective. Now the detour ends up being what holds Ryan and Dusty back here, where the two choices are either to use mules to transport cancers of goat milk, which seem to be the much easier task, though obviously you are reliant on an animal, which can be highly variant. But the other task was making cheese, which to me seemed to be more difficult, but most of the teams actually do end up going for this, including Ryan and Dusty, with them being really confident in making cheese, with Dusty having made cheese in the past. But here they don't seem to follow the instructions, with them constantly messing with the temperature, while the other teams don't, which allows them to get through it much quicker. And I really did like this scene of watching team after team after team pass them, and them getting more and more frustrated with it, to the point where they end up switching detours after all the teams had already left, which really did make it seem like they were in a pretty precarious position here. Again, switching detours after literally every other team had finished the detour on any normal leg would be an insane decision, but really the rest of the leg ends up going perfectly for them, and they end up catching back up to the point where they end up finishing in third. But despite that, I did find this leg to be somewhat suspenseful, even though I was pretty confident they were going to make it through it. Now, Kim and Penn do also have a pretty flawless leg here, with them finishing in first, and we do get this weird storyline about there being a new Kim, and I really didn't get why this was a thing, but whatever. Lulu and Lala also have a strong leg initially here, being in second coming into the roadblock, but then proceed to be passed by Raquel and Kayla. After initially working together, the Raquel ends up taking an opportunity to pass them, and later also get passed by Arun, Natalia, and Ryan and Dusty right before the pit stop, with them not reading the clue that told them to leave their bags in the van, which ends up losing them a lot of time there, and landing them all the way back in 5th place. But again, this entire leg seemed to be really close, with all of it involving chartered transportation, meaning that the tasks themselves decided pretty much everything, and also leading up to places 2nd through 5th all being at the pit stop at the same time. And during the scene, we do see like Dusty really cheering pretty obnoxiously as they get to the pit stop, and I did find it really humorous how Raquel and Kayla are kind of mocking them in the background. But with that, I haven't really mentioned Akbar and Sherry yet, and they obviously do come in last here. And I did find this to be a pretty entertaining leg from them, first with Akbar mocking Ryan and Dusty's cooking skills at the Detour, and following that up with the Roadblock, where Akbar ends up doing it this time, and he ends up being the sole reason why they come in last, with them initially coming into the Roadblock in 4th place, but he ends up getting passed by both Arun and Ryan, which to me ended up being a really humorous way to conclude the storyline of Akbar and Sherry here. Obviously, with Akbar in the past having been so upset at Sherry during every task due to her slowing them down, only for him to be the actual reason why they end up going home here. So again, I found that to be pretty fun. But with that, let's talk about Akbar and Sherry, who I found to be one of the more entertaining teams on this season. And while they did argue constantly, and at points it felt like a little bit icky, I still found them to be pretty interesting TV here. Obviously, they're not the greatest racers here, and I was, in general, just surprised to see them make it this far, to see them avoid coming in last for as long as they did, considering the fact that I think they're probably the worst team on the season, at least from a physical standpoint for sure. But again, I was happy to see them make it as far as they did here, especially after the break, where they ended up being really the only team that had any true intra-team conflict at this point. So again, I did like what they brought to the show. Now for episode 7, which just start off being pretty interesting, again revolving around this Ryan and Dusty storyline, along with the teams also being really close for most of the leg, which made it seem on paper like anything could happen, but there was a lack of a real equalizer throughout the leg that did make the overall leg kind of meh by the end of it, where like the initial 2 teams to leave in Kim and Penn and Raquel and Kayla really had an easy road in staying in 1st and 2nd place as long as they didn't have any major screw-ups here. And they do end up working together throughout most of the leg. Now we do start the leg with them having to eat cheese that has maggots in it, and I mean that was obviously disgusting, but it also really didn't lead to any real entertainment. Though on the way to it, we do get some intrigue from Raquel and Kayla being a bit crafty with them letting Kim and Penn take the lead, only for them to miss the turn, which allows Raquel and Kayla to pass them, and kind of adding to the storyline of them being cutthroat throughout the race. But they do end up working together beyond that and easily come in 1st and 2nd. Ryan and Dusty again get a lot of focus around this, like, are they going to screw up storyline? And during the Detour, their kayak ends up filling up with water and capsizes, and this clip was really a major source of intrigue in the leg, with this being used in all of the commercials, but really it doesn't end up mattering, and they end up coming in 3rd, while Lulu and Lala and Arun and Natalia work together through their Detour and end up messing up at it, making it clear that they were going to be at the bottom. But despite that, they still continue to work together throughout the leg, which I did find kind of weird. As again, like, you would think that once you know you're going to be the bottom 2, it's like you would kind of separate a bit, but the episode does end kind of anticlimactically, with Arun and Natalia coming in last once again, with this ending up being another non-elimination leg that just kind of felt ridiculous at this point, how many chances Arun and Natalia were getting. But also did add a level of frustration with just how many non-elimination legs there were across the season, and how dragged out the race kind of felt, with essentially every other leg being a non-elimination leg. Now for episode 8, where we do go to Greece for what ends up being a mostly mundane episode. Now I did probably enjoy the tasks in this episode more than your average episode from this season. As pertaining to the race, I mean, while there were numerous placement changes throughout the leg ends with very similar results to the previous legs. Now, I did find it weird that this leg did shake up the normal structure a bit by having 2 roadblocks instead of having a detour in there. And both roadblocks did lead to a level of intrigue. I mean, we do see Raquel struggling at the first one, and for the first time probably in the entire race, they end up in last place. Though obviously by the end of the leg, they end up recovering. They also have a pretty fun character moment here of not being able to reach the clue in the tree, despite there being a ladder behind them that could have helped them. But from an edit standpoint, this is around the point where I did get a bit back on board with Raquel and Kayla as potential winners, with them seeming to get a bit more focus now now, particularly around how they've been coming in second place and that they are a consistent team, which again boosted them back into winter contention for me, along with Kim and Penn, who remained as consistent as they have been, dominating this leg coming in first again. Ryan and Dusty had a bit of a rocky leg again here, where despite Dusty doing really well in the first roadblock and again being kind of obnoxious immediately afterwards, Ryan ends up struggling on the second one, which was a more mental one, which again definitely feels like their weakness as a team. But despite all that, they still come in third. But once again, it does come down to Arun and Natalia and Lulu and Lala being as the bottom two. And while Arun and Natalia still struggle with directions, they do end up scraping by, largely due to Lulu and Lala having a bit of a disastrous leg here, with them getting so lost on the way to the food truck that they end up accidentally arriving at the pit stop instead. And we also have them not finding the clue in the wrapper at the food truck, which ends up with them eating 2 servings while they were there until they were able to figure out. And by the time they get to the second roadblock, it did seem pretty clear that they were way behind and that the edit was trying to cover it up to make it seem like it was closer than what it really was. But again, they do end up coming in last here and do end up being eliminated. And with that, let's talk about Lulu and Lala, who I found to be pretty likable figures across the season, but also a team that really didn't bring that much to the show by the end of it. Again, there was a point where I was suspecting that they were going to be potential winners, with them getting this storyline about racing for their grandma, but in the last few episodes, that notion kind of waned, with them stopping to get as much focus as they had in the first few episodes after the break. But again, they were a mostly fine team from an entertainment standpoint, but also seemed to be kind of mediocre racers and really just end up being overshadowed in both aspects by a lot of other teams on the season. Now for episode 9, the penultimate episode, and I mean, this was so clearly another non-elimination episode coming into it, because I mean, obviously we still have 2 legs after this one, and we're already at the final 4, and obviously Amazing Race doesn't do these non-elimination legs for the final 3 anymore. So again, it was so clear to me that this was going to be a non-elim the entire time. That did make this kind of a dull episode, as it really just felt like none of this mattered. I mean, a lot of it is focused around this like needle and haystack comp of finding a coin under a stone, which was mostly boring and largely luck-based, which could have screwed over Ryan and Dusty here, which would have been a really underwhelming way for them to go home, as they do end up really struggling here and come in last. But I will say that even though the actual task itself was mundane, I did like the focus around Ryan and Dusty here, with Dusty talking about his anger issues, and we have like Ryan trying to calm him down, and they take the time to look at the scenery, and like, that was a nice scene there. We'd also have Raquel and Kayla finally winning a leg here, which did make me question their winning chances, as again, at this point I was thinking that they were going to be the winners, but I was suspecting they were going to be the winners without having won a leg until that final one. So the fact that they end up winning a leg here and it coming off as a bit unceremonious to me, but I mean, outside of that, there's not much from this episode. It was pretty boring. And let's just get into the finale, which starts off with the penultimate leg in Lisbon, which ends up being a pretty baseline leg that didn't really have that much suspense to me, considering how outclassed Arun and Natalia seemed to be here. And the moment that they start falling behind in the first roadblock, with Arun not knowing how to row a boat, it did feel pretty clear that their chances of coming out of that were pretty low, especially considering they literally start the leg with a confessional talking about how there's no room for error here. Though there was like a point where like the bottom 3 teams were all getting the same clue at the same time. But again, it really did feel like Arun and Natalia were getting set up here to come in last, though along the way every team does end up struggling. And we have Raquel and Kayla, who do come out on top again here, despite the fact that they go the wrong way at multiple points across the leg and also leave their map behind to where they have to go and buy a new one. Kim and Penn struggle at the door painting task and also with the column counting task, which, by the way, both of those were kind of lame. And again, this is another leg that really just mostly comprised of roadblocks, which at this point kind of felt like them just cheapening out to where they only have to have 1 task instead of 2. Ryan and Dusty also have missteps where Ryan ends up having to row his boat twice because he gets the wrong one, and then they also don't realize they have to paint the doorknob. It leads to them coming second to last. But again, really no suspense in the overall leg, with Arun and Natalia clearly coming in last here. And I do love Arun and Natalia. I mean, they're not the greatest racers, and I really can't believe they even made it this far, but I did find them to be a really likable team, with Arun in particular being a really fun character. However, I do think them making it this far does kind of add to this element of me not being able to take this season as seriously from a competitive standpoint, as they really just continue to get lucky over and over and over again, despite having technically already been eliminated in the race beforehand, and because I was overall content with seeing them go home here. But with that, let's get into the final leg, which was fine. I mean, there was a lot of back and forth with Raquel and Kayla and Kim and Penn being really close throughout the entire leg. But despite that, I kind of felt like the middle portion of this leg was mostly boring. Now, we do see like Ryan and Dusty right away getting behind at the first task of them having to find the code to a lock that they had to solve a riddle to find, and they really end up struggling there and really never able to recover afterwards. And through that, it kind of makes their downfall a bit humorous here in that it does come from a mental comp. Again, they proclaimed earlier in the season that they're going to win because of their physicality and try to avoid mental comps, and obviously that ends up being their undoing here. We do get this like pinata smashing task. That was something. We get like a Foley comp that was cool, that they had the Foley like 5 different scenes from across Amazing Race history. That was a cool callback. But I mean, outside of that, again, mostly boring. I mean, these 2 tasks really just did not do much for me. But immediately after it, we do see Raquel and Kayla leaving just as Kim and Penn exit the building, which was really thrilling to see them being that close that late into this leg, and them even like asking the same guy for instructions. And it really just all comes down to this final memory comp, which I was kind of surprised to see them do a memory comp here, considering the break in the middle of the race. That would have made me think that they wouldn't have expected them to remember these sort of things. But while coming into this final task, I did feel like it was kind of even on who could win it. The editing of this task did really give it away, in the fact that Kim and Penn talk about how they've taken notes and how they drew pictures in preparation for this. And again, they do end up winning pretty underwhelmingly to me. Like, I'll be honest, like, I do find this to be the worst outcome for the season. Not that I dislike Kim and Penn. Again, Kim and Penn are lovely people. They seem like fun people. They have a fun energy, but I just felt like their win here was kind of generic and without like a major storyline leading to their win, which, I mean, to be fair, Amazing Race has not always cared about having like a proper storyline across its season. But to me, that is a flaw I have with the show, especially when like the other 2 teams that were in the final 3 here had more interesting storylines to lead to a win. And considering how much Raquel and Kayla's in particular was focused on in the edit. Now, at the very end of the episode, one of the last confessionals we get is from Kim talking about her facing her anxiety. And Penn says, oh, this is your win. And like, I guess that's the storyline they were trying to tell here. But I never really felt like we saw much of that outside of when she like jumps off the dam. And like, I guess maybe the last episode where she's like breaking the plates. But it's like, overall, like, I just feel like from a storytelling standpoint, I was underwhelmed with this outcome. Though again, considering Amazing Race editing, I never really had Kim and Penn completely off the board. Before wrapping up the review here, let's talk about the final 3, starting with Ryan and Dusty, who did initially come off as this like overachieving team that was going to dominate the race. But once they stumble and get out of the top 2, they really don't recover after that. But I think through seeing them struggle, it did make them a lot more likable of a team. Again, at first they come off as this really one-note group, but I do think they were given more complexity towards the end of the season, particularly on Dusty's end, that did make them likable figures by the end of it. And while I had written them off as winners early on, as they never overtly talk about a team that ends up winning the season as a dominating team, and early on in the season, as they did with Ryan and Dusty, I did think their pretty lackluster back half of the race did build up a bit of a redemption arc in the last few rounds to where I could have seen them winning as like this underdog story, but obviously that doesn't go through. Next, we have Raquel and Kayla, who again to me would have been the most satisfying winners from a storytelling standpoint. I mean, we got so much talk about them wanting to be the 4th ever all-woman team to win the race, and I do think that would have been a great way to end this season, especially with them having a really strong run at the end here, and really ended up being in the top 2 for the last 6 legs of the race. And I did find both of them to be really likable figures here as well, though I will say that something I didn't really notice until after the season finish is that I don't feel like we've gotten to know them as individuals that well. Like, I feel like I actually know nothing about them outside of their core storyline about wanting to win, and also them being flight attendants that lost their jobs. So like, while I always felt like they were likable figures, they weren't really given that much complexity as individuals across this season. And finally, we have the winners in Kim and Penn, who again, I didn't think were the most satisfying winners from the season from a storytelling standpoint. I mean, again, they are a team that had fun moments here and there, though realistically, I felt like a lot of those were pretty minor. They are a likable team, but I just found them kind of like baseline TV for a lot of it, which is kind of surprising considering they are these like big wacky figures that have this like really zany content on their YouTube channel. But yeah, as racers though, I mean, they are an incredibly strong team. I mean, they did end up pretty much dominating the back 2/3 of the race here, winning 5 legs by the end of it, which is very impressive. And they have, I believe, the 5th best average in the history of the Amazing Race, 3rd best winning average, only behind Rachel and Dave and Megan and Shane. So again, that is very impressive. They are a very good winning team here. That being said, I do feel like there is a bit of an asterisk in that 4 teams were not able to come back, with 2 of those teams probably being 2 of the better teams on the season, particularly Anthony and Spencer, but even Connie and Sam were fine, with 3 of those 4 teams having higher average placements than the 4 teams that didn't make the final 3 here that did come back. So again, that's definitely a big asterisk to me, but still, again, a very impressive race here from them. And overall, they are very affable figures to where, again, they do feel very fun on paper, but I just feel like they were portrayed in not the most interesting light to me, to where I was kind of underwhelmed with them as characters. But with that, let's wrap up the review here. I mean, overall, The Amazing Race 33 is a season that on paper is pretty mediocre. I mean, the format is terrible, where there was pretty much a non-elimination leg every other leg, with the removal of 4 teams and the return of 2 others. It really made a lot of this race just feel like an exhibition match, especially because all these changes really just allowed the 3 competent teams that ended up being the final 3 here to kind of just have an easy road to the end, where I felt like there was almost no suspense throughout the entire season on who was going home, really outside of that first episode where Ryan and Dusty have a misstep. It never actually felt like any of these teams were truly in danger. Also, again, like, I am very underwhelmed by the storytelling of this season, particularly in its outcome. However, again, despite all that, I still have a positive opinion of this season anyway. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that I just really, really like this cast. And while we didn't get to know much about the people that didn't end up coming back, I feel like we got to know a lot about the people that did come back. And while the race itself was boring at points, and a lot of the episodes didn't have that much going on, I do feel like this season is greater than the sum of its parts, largely due to how much I like this cast and appreciate the storylines throughout most of the season. Now, while I don't really remember my season rankings particularly well, I do suspect that this would probably end up landing middle of the road, maybe slightly below average, hovering somewhere in the high 20s or so. Where again, I mean, there are still very glaring holes across this season, but I really come out of the season with a positive vibe on it at the end of the day, which I feel like is largely due to its cast. But I mean, there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on The Amazing Race 33. Now, I do believe season 34 should be filming later this year, so obviously whenever that airs, you can expect a review of that. I'll be honest, outside of that, I just don't know how many other Amazing Race videos I'm that apt to do in the near future, though I do have one in the back burner that might be released at some point, who knows. And I do have other video ideas for The Amazing Race down the road, it's just a matter of actually getting around to doing them. But either way, for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.